Hello and welcome to Nirmal, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Hiral Datia. We have with us Mr. C.M. Vasudev, former Economic Affairs Secretary, joining in. Welcome to the show, Mr. Vasudev, and always a pleasure to speak to you and get insights from you. Mr. Vasudev, what would your first view be of the overall budget?
Well, it's a little bit of feeling of relief in the sense that because of the ongoing election season, there was a lot of expectation that it will be a very populist budget with the elections in mind. But fortunately, the finance minister has chosen not to be populist and has stuck to the path of fiscal rectitude, I would say, to some extent, and also framed a budget which is growth oriented, maybe a little in the medium term, not in that sense, but certainly a growth oriented budget. And a lot of fiscal prudence is there in that. And I'm sure she's also mindful of the inflationary tendencies which are there globally and which will affect the Indian economy sooner or later.
Right. And overall, if you see in terms of where a couple of key things that were announced, especially in terms of goals of Amrit Kal, the focus has been on growth and all-inclusive welfare. They are promoting technology-enabled development, energy transition, climate action. So again, from the four priorities they've got out, say inclusive development, PM Gati Shakti, as well as financing of investments and productivity enhancement and investment. What's your view on that front? Do you think that's something which actually will lead to recovery of the economy? Is that a reflection of it?
Yes, certainly. There is, when you are framing a budget or when you're framing a policy for imparting a growth stimulus, there are two options available. One is a demand-driven type of an approach, where some governments could have done or could adopt that approach, which mostly the more developed economies do that, to give more money in the hands of the consumers. And then that consumer stimulates demand, and then that leads to a growth. Whereas the other option is to invest the savings and then give a momentum for growth through the investments. And for developing countries, this latter approach is certainly a better approach, and it does give a more inclusive growth also. Of course, one has to strike a balance between the demand-driven stimulation and the investment-driven stimulation. But I think the weightage has to be on the investment-oriented approach, which I think the finance minister has correctly followed in this case.
Right. And overall, do you think, since 2014, if you go to see, the government's focus, as they've said, has been empowerment of people, and that they're committed to strengthening the ability of the poor to tap the opportunities. Does the budget actually reflect this, what the government has said?
Well, that is a little bit of a weakness, I would say, in the budget, in the sense that the poorer sections of society and the people who are on daily earnings, hand-to-mouth type of livelihood, they were the hardest hit by the pandemic, and they've loss of jobs in that sector, loss of jobs in the service sector at that level. Poverty levels also have gone up. So I was expecting a little bit more flavor, at least in the budget speech, to recognize the difficulties that this category of population has gone through, and how the government is trying to help them or will try to help them, and how whatever announcements they have made for imparting a growth momentum, how that will sort of flow to this category of people. That is something I would have liked to see a little more prominently in the budget speech, but for some reason it is not there.
Right. Again, in terms of where the capex is concerned, they've stepped it up to around 7.5 lakh crores, which is almost around 2.9% of the GDP. And effective capex is seen at 10.7 lakh crores in FY23. What do you make of this number?
I think it is a very good thing that there is a 34% or 35% increase in the capex expenditure of the central government. And as you're saying, the effective capex, if you take into account the grants in aid and all, with the central government to the states, which are also for investment and all that, and even to some extent, the Manrega expenditure is also a form of capex because it is used for creating some assets in rural areas. So this focus on investment-driven growth, which is coming out, I think, in all areas in the budget speech, I think is a good thing. Apart from public investment, which is the main driver, it should also crowd in a lot of private investment, as the finance minister herself has mentioned. And it will also have a lot of linkages with the service sector, who will also gain because of this investment. So it is a right way to go.
Right. And on the fiscal deficit front as well, the target is set at 6.4% for FY23. Do you think that's something which could be an achievable number?
I think it should be now because they have not splurged with the sort of extra revenues that they were able to get during the year, and revenue realizations were higher than what was budgeted. And the buoyancy next year with the growth that is projected and the inflation also. And so in actual terms, the revenue will be very good. So there should not be a problem to achieve the 6.4% fiscal deficit target. And also the 25-26 target, they should keep in mind of 4%. But, more important than really the fiscal deficit target or the number is also the quality of the fiscal deficit. If you're borrowing and if you're going to spend on consumption type of expenditure and giveaways in the budget and this and that, then of course you're not creating any capacity in the system to repay the borrowings. But if you're going to use the fiscal deficit and borrow money which is going to be used for investment, which in this particular case seems to be because of the 34% increase in the capital expenditure. So whatever fiscal deficit is there and whatever borrowing one government will do to finance the fiscal deficit will be used for creating assets, which should create a capacity in the system to repay that borrowing, which is a good thing. So therefore, quality of fiscal deficit is equally, if not more important than the absolute number.
Right. And overall, what were the key misses according to you from the budget?
One, I have already told you that about the people who have been hardest hit by the pandemic, the shock that they have received during that period, and also the inflationary impact on them. And the numbers also have shown how the gulf between the rich and the poor has widened, and how the poverty numbers have also worsened. So that is a big miss, I would say, in the budget speech. I'm sure if one sees the fine print of the expenditure budget, there'll be more in that area which will happen. But I think since the budget speech catches the headlines, I would have expected the finance minister to say something even to that category of the population. That is number one. Number two, also, I think the farmers issue, of course, there is something here and there, and the numbers for the MSP payments, which will be made for procurement directly to the accounts of the farmers. But a little bit more, I would have expected on the farmers' issues, since they were so much in the limelight for 1 year, how the government is concerned about it, and how the government is going to deal with it, and what are the other incentives and things they are going to do for the farming sector and for the non-farm sector in the rural areas. Something of that type in the budget speech, I have missed, certainly.
Right. And Mr. Vasudev, overall, in terms of the key highlights, what according to you have been the main points of focus which would actually make a difference?
Well, the main focus is the public sector-driven investment strategy, which has been adopted very clearly in this, and recognizing that the private sector doesn't have the resources at this point of time to invest in the infrastructure type of projects. So the public sector driven investment in infrastructure with the hope and expectation of crowding in private sector investment in that area. I think that that is the main strategy that seems to be behind framing of this budget.
Right. And overall, especially in terms of other sectors, what they've focused on is, especially in terms of healthcare, education. Do you think that is something which could be a game changer?
Yeah, education, she said a lot. In health, of course, in the last year also, and I think the first charge on government expenditure last budget was providing vaccination to the large population, and the budget for the health sector was considerably augmented. So that has become the base, and I'm sure there is a little bit of increase over that base in this budget also. I have not seen the actual numbers, but when one sees the demands for grants of individual departments and ministries, we'll get a better idea of how much increases in which sector. But I'm sure health and education would have got a very fair share of the increase in the government expenditure, apart from the 35% increase in capex. And also in the defense, I think this idea of 58% of the defense procurement and the capital expenditure will be reserved for the domestic enterprises, which is also a good thing.
Right. And overall, if you see from a taxation perspective as well, we've not really seen any major changes that did come in on the personal taxation front. Do you think that could be a deterrent?
Sorry, come again?
On the personal taxation front, we've not seen any changes in terms of tax slabs or anything. Do you think that's something that wouldn't be taken well?
Well, the hallmark of a good tax policy is that there should be stability. It's not a good idea to keep tinkering with tax slabs and tax rates every year. And so I think it's a good thing that this government is providing stability to the tax regime. Why tinker? There'll be changes. And after all, in this pandemic period, the taxpayer segment of the population certainly was not as worse off as the others who were living from hand to mouth. So whatever money the taxpayer is giving, so there has to be some recognition of this redistribution aspect of the budgetary resources.
Absolutely.
I feel the stability in tax policy is the hallmark of a good tax policy.
Right. And overall on the GST front as well, clearly, if you see the numbers that have come in for the month of January are really encouraging. I mean, 1,46,000 odd crores is what we've seen. Do you think that is a signal which tells us that this is a time where the economy is recovering? There is stability that is emerging. Is that a step in that direction?
No, certainly. And also, I would say that the benefits which were expected to come from the GST regime when the GST was started, those benefits have been a little late in coming, but now I think as the numbers are showing, the benefits are coming into the economy. The increase in indirect tax revenues from the GST as compared to the earlier regime, the numbers are going up, but they have to grow even more, even faster, because there was an expectation that GST will give a bounce of 1 to 2% in the GDP. So we are waiting for that to happen, but at least the trend is now in that direction, which is a good sign.
Right. And overall, if you see in terms of on the virtual asset front, that is something which was not really expected. I mean, everyone was really waiting for an announcement where they've said that the virtual assets will be taxed at 30%. Does this actually mean that they're opening up doors for crypto assets, NFTs, etc.?
Well, I don't know whether they're opening doors, but they are certainly trying to ensure that this crypto domain is taxed, and it's not a free run, and it should not become so widespread. So at every stage, if there is going to be a taxation when you're going to buy or sell a crypto with a TDS and all, it will be a big deterrent in that sense, and probably rein in the sort of growth of this crypto domain in a more holistic or a more realistic manner. Otherwise, if it were to grow and there was no tax and people were making money through speculation and this and that, which there were hints earlier also from the Prime Minister's level and also Finance Minister that government is concerned about this unbridled type of growth that was taking place. So they have put some brakes on that, combined with the RBI going to introduce its own cryptocurrency and all that. So I think the government seems to be aware of the pitfalls in that.
Right. And overall, on the divestment front as well, I mean, it's always been a case where we've seen a miss that comes in on the divestment front. What's the sense that you pick up?
I don't know. Has she announced any number for disinvestment for next
No,
year?
nothing as of now. I mean, the only thing that we have is in terms of LIC, which is expected shortly,
No,
and
that
there
was
would be
for
further
that was
announcements that will be coming in.
last year's budget.
Correct.
It's never a good idea, I felt, to announce a disinvestment number in the budget. It's not a good idea at all. Because then it sort of raises expectations in the market and various other things, and you don't get a best price. So you have a disinvestment as a strategy, and you have laid down what type of PSUs you want to disinvest, or what type of PSUs you want to remain in the government fold. And as opportunities arise, you go and disinvest. But to announce in advance that we will have 1,75,000 crore disinvestment receipts in the year, I think that was a bad idea last year. And it's a good thing that they're not given any numbers this year, because unnecessary, I think, raises expectations in the market.
So, right. And very lastly,
having said that,
yeah,
even with 1,75,000 crore target last year, achievement of 20,000 crores so far, and plus LIC, I don't know how much it will be, but still it will be barely be 10% of what the target, or 10-12% of the target. So there is something missing in the process of disinvestment, which I think needs to be looked into. And I'm sure the government, finance ministry, and the Prime Minister's office and all will have a look at the process. Why is it so cumbersome? Why is it so slow? Why this was such a good year for disinvestment? Markets were running so high, so government would have got such a good price for the assets they wanted to sell. Nothing has happened. And also the monetization of the public assets, that also is remained on paper. There is no mention also in this year's budget speech. So these are a few misses that one can point out.
In fact, on the divestment front, in fact, for FY22, the target was lowered in the speech to 78,000 crores from 1.75 lakh crores, as you indicated. Right. And in fact, they've given out a number for 23 at 65,000 crores.
They have given the number?
Yeah, 65,000 crores is what the government has set as a target.
Okay. If they have given, it's okay, but I would not say that there should be any number for disinvestment. It raises expectations in the market analysts, and people like you who watch the market will then start saying, what is 65, you've done 10, what about 15, when are you going to do it, what is going to sell, this, that. So it sort of raises expectations in the market, which may not be a very healthy thing for the person who wants to sell his assets. But there is a case, I think, for reviewing the procedure and the process and how this investment is being handled within government, so that whatever you want to do, you do it faster. It shouldn't take a year to decide on one aspect. Look at the LIC, look at this Neelanchal Nigam, and look at the BPCL. They're all, so this was such a good year for BPCL, and all markets were running so high. But they've not been able to do it. Now, that is the problem, with bureaucrats dealing with disinvestment. They become very risk averse, because at whatever price it is sold in the market, if you see the stock prices, once this way or 2 months that way, there will be always some price which is higher than what you have sold. So they are always risk averse, and so they're trying to find ways of cushioning themselves, and that takes so much of time in the process.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
very lastly, Mr. Vasudev, in terms of growth, 8 to 8.5% is the kind of projection that the economic survey has said as well for FY23. Taking this number into consideration, do you think there would be hurdles with regards to inflation, number one? And two, how do you see the RBI responding to this in terms of the policy, the rate decisions?
But couple of things here.
Mm.
One is if you see the last number for this 22-23, which is 9.2% or so. And what it was 2 years ago before the pandemic, we are almost at the same level. So the GDP, what it was 2 years ago, is what it is now. So which means we have lost 2 years of growth. So assuming it was 6% every year, so we lost 12% of growth during this 2-year period. So whatever you are going to do now, if it is going to be sort of counted, it has to be counted against that. That is number one. Number two, I think in the total year number for 21-22 is healthy, but the last quarter, I think there have been slippages, and it came down to even 5-6% or something like that. I was reading somewhere. So momentum seems to have slowed down. So this target that they have in mind of 8.5% GDP growth, it is going to be difficult to achieve. And so RBI, in the sense, whatever RBI can do, I'm sure will do. But there are a lot of headwinds to achieve that number of 8.5%. And especially if we are able, if we import some inflationary tendencies from the global market, that is going to make RBI's task even more difficult. It will have to tighten the belt and to deal with inflation. So given the numbers for the last quarter or last 6 months of 21-22 and the slippages that we have seen, this 8.5% next year, a lot of headwinds.
Absolutely. I think a lot of things that we need to watch out for. Thank you, Mr. Vasudev, so much for joining us on the show. Always a pleasure to speak to you and get really good insights from you and understanding. Thank you. Stay safe and speak to you soon again.
Thank you very much. All the best. Bye.
Subscribe to our YouTube channel for in-depth interviews of India Inc. and press the bell icon so that you do not miss our updates.